The Industrialization of Agriculture, Part 4, Consequence of Size and Specialization. If I was to describe a typical U.S. farm in 1900, I would say it had probably 80 acres of crops, and those crops would be wheat, cotton, legumes, things like that, but a mix of different crops, not just one. There would be probably 50 hogs, 40 cows, 20 laying hens, and although the farmer may purchase her plow from a company and purchase the lumber to build her barn from a company, a lot of her inputs she's going to make herself. The fertilization she needs for a farm, the fertilizer, she's going to produce. Pest control, she's going to need to produce it. Animal and human muscle, her muscle, and workhorse and mule's muscle. But farms have changed a lot since 1900. And there's a documentary, Fresh, and the documentary is very critical of industrial agriculture. And there was a scene where a Corn Belt farmer made this remark. He said, most of the farms when I started farming had livestock on them. People were raising hogs, people were raising cattle, and even some people when I was a kid had chickens. These big corporations industrialized livestock production. That took the livestock off of the family farm and put them in these big factories. Now, certainly he was against that, but even if you're for industrialization of agriculture, you have to admit that he's right. Farms have changed a lot. Agriculture has become industrialized. And one reason I say that is because modern agriculture, with its specialization, it needs industrial inputs. Farmers today place greater reliance on other firms for much of what they need. A farmer years ago, 100 years ago, would have produced their own fertilizer for the farm. But today farmers get nitrogen fertilizer from big chemical, using advanced chemistry in huge factories that take natural gas and advanced science and is able to put out nitrogen in a chemical form. For the phosphorus and potassium fertilizers, they're mined from the earth. Pesticides are produced by large corporations using advanced chemistry in large factories. And most of the muscle, most of the energy, the power today on farms don't come from human muscle or animals, but fossil fuels and huge machines. I want to start us off, and I'm going to take us down a road thinking of fertilizer, pesticide, mechanization, its impacts on agriculture. And at this point, we're not trying to say whether it's good or bad, but we want to look at how it's changed the face of agriculture. And I want to first start with chemical fertilizer and read you part of one of my favorite stories in agriculture. This is from a podcast from The Story from American Public Media. One person on the show says he's describing what's going on in Guatemala at a time when evangelicals are allowed into Guatemala and they start converting a lot of Catholics. He says, a Guatemalan citizen states, God started moving in the whole community through different miracles that happened. People were getting saved. Even I heard of people being raised from the dead, curing alcoholism, families being restored. You didn't see all the drunks on the street anymore. It was a complete change. And according to evangelical lore, not only did the character of the people change, the God blessed and healed the land so that they could grow more vegetables and big vegetables. And the records show the vegetables got bigger. So this is a scenario where there were big conversions from Catholicism to evangelical Christianity. And at the same time, all of a sudden, people had a lot more food. A lot more food, so much that it seemed a miracle. But later on this show, they say this. A leading Guatemalan economist published an article about a Guatemalan region in which he points out that the mass conversion of evangelism occurred around the same time as chemical fertilizers, new seeds, and new crops were being introduced to Guatemala. What this means is that chemical fertilizer is so productive, it has such a big impact on how much food people can produce, it was mistaken for a divine miracle. To me, I think that says wonders about chemical fertilizer. And certainly when we look at this graph here, we've seen nitrogen, especially nitrogen fertilizer, we have potash and phosphate there too, become an increasingly important part of agriculture. We buy nitrogen in chemical form from factories, whereas before, farmers got their nitrogen fertilizer through more organic ways. They would have to use crop rotations, where instead of planting corn in the same field year after year after year, you would plant corn and then maybe beans, because beans are a legume, and that legume can reach up into the atmosphere, grab nitrogen that most plants can't and put it down into the soil for next year's corn planting. And of course, manure as well. A lot of farms who raise crops would also want to have manure because the manure can be nitrogen fertilizer. But now with chemical fertilizer, we don't need crop rotations anymore. We don't need livestock manure. This lets farms become specialized, less diversified. I've got a fact here. It's a citation. Without chemical fertilizer, some think we could feed only 60 to 70% of the current population. Now, I want you to know, when I say make a statement like that, it's not a fact. That is a calculation from a good authority. It's based on some assumptions about the world, but we don't actually know what the world would be like without chemical fertilizers. So I'm not presenting that as a fact. It's only a statement as a testimony to how productive nitrogen fertilizers can be. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The nitrogen we're getting out of the sky, the fertilizer factories, what they do is they go into the atmosphere and they're able to grab the nitrogen that most plants can't and put in a chemical form that we could feed to plants. The phosphorus and potassium, we're mining it from the earth. And when we apply these fertilizers to soils, in a way, it's kind of like we're making new soil. If you go to an area of ground that can't grow much, something you would call dirt instead of soil, and you start putting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to it, all of a sudden the soil will become more productive. You can start growing things on the ground, and as the plants start growing and leaving behind residues, organic matter begins to form in the ground, and eventually you actually have something that you can call soil. So in a way, these chemical fertilizers is letting us produce more soil. Now, that's good and bad. It's good because we are losing a lot of soil through erosion. So this quote-unquote new soil is helping to replace that old soil, or at least making land so much more productive we don't have to worry about soil erosion as much. But the bad part about that is we probably should be worried about soil erosion. And we don't want chemical fertilizers to take our mind off that. Another bad aspect of chemical fertilizers or manure fertilizer, either one, is that whatever kind of fertilizer you put on the ground, 30 to 50% of it is going to leave the field. And some of that 30 to 50% is going to enter some surface waters and cause water pollution. You see in the lower right-hand corner here, this is a lake in Oklahoma that received so much fertilizer and manure runoff that there were a lot of nutrients for algae and bacteria populations. So the algae population there just exploded. And as it exploded, it took over the lake, and it also consumes all the oxygen from the water. It causes something called eutrophication, essentially killing the lake. Now I should point out here, this lake, most people think most of the pollution came from chicken manure. However, where did that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the chicken manure come from? It came from the chicken, of course. The chicken got the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from the feed, corn and soybean meal. Where did the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from the soybean meal come from and corn? It came from chemical fertilizers. So whether it's manure or chemical fertilizers directly causing water pollution, chemical fertilizers are the ultimate cause. Now, you know, I made this joke. It's kind of a sad joke that we have to say it like this, but you can tell how well a population is fed. One, just by looking at the people and seeing how healthy they are, or looking at the amount of water pollution. You look at China, who's adopted chemical fertilizers in the last 40 years and done a really good job of increasing their food production. They feed their people very well now. They're having big problems with water pollution. It's just hard to use fertilizers of any kind and produce a lot of food without causing some water pollution. Now certainly, we can produce a lot of food while not polluting as much. We just haven't chosen to do so yet. We've looked at some benefits and costs of fertilizers. Now let's look at pesticides. And I like to think of pesticides as being like a scarecrow, but way more effective. Pesticides protect plants from weeds, from insects, and from diseases. There was a study that showed that if we eliminated all pesticides from crop production, it would increase wheat prices by 6%. Okay, that's not a lot. rice prices by 83%. That is a lot, especially for much of the developing world that relies on rice as a staple crop. Peanut prices by 150%. For someone who eats peanut butter and jelly sandwiches like me, that's something we should be concerned about. So there are big benefits to pesticides. And also I've got here, and would perhaps result in 26,000 deaths. That's one of those little, it's not a fact, it's presented as a fact, but it's what someone calculated under certain assumptions about the world. But the point of all this is that pesticides do a lot for crop production, especially when it comes to fruit and vegetables. One of the main reasons we can consume so many fruits and vegetables today, if we choose to, I know not everybody does choose to, is because pesticides help make fruits and vegetables more productive. And this little citation, when they say eliminating pesticides would perhaps result in 26,000 deaths, what they were trying to say was, if we eliminated pesticides, the price of fruit and vegetables would go up. As people consume less fruits and vegetables, they become less healthy and mortality rises. So pesticides are good. It lowers prices and allows us to consume more fruits and vegetables. But of course, there's a downside to pesticides. It's said that diversity is the enemy of pests. Before we had these synthetic pesticides like we do today, farmers would have to rotate crops a lot. To give you an example, 100 years ago, a farmer would not just plant corn in the same field year after year after year. Because if worms infected that field this year, they're going to lay eggs and have babies the next year. And if you plant corn in that same field, you're basically growing the food that those baby worms need to live off of. Whereas instead of plant corn in the same field year after year, you plant corn, you have worms, the worms lay eggs, and then you follow it with something called soybeans that the worms don't eat. You put it into that cycle of pests. That's why we say diversity is the enemy of pests. But pesticides allow us to get rid of pests without diversity. Pesticides allow us to plant corn in the same field year after year after year. And it turns out the availability of pesticides, farmers, food manufacturers, they can only make money by producing things that consumers want. And it turns out that when pesticides are available to us, the American public doesn't want as much diversity as would exist if we didn't have pesticides. What I mean is this. What do Americans love? Meat, dairy, eggs. What feeds those animals? Corn. That's why we have fields and fields planting corn year after year after year. We can do that because of pesticides. So pesticides allow monocultures. Monocultures just planting the same thing year after year after year. But monocultures can be dangerous in a way because they invite pest resistance. And some fear if we just have monocultures, like say Ireland did in the mid-19th century, we may have the same problem that Ireland did in the mid-19th century, a big pest infestation that destroys everything, lots and lots of food. And of course, some people think synthetic pesticides, the way we handle them, are dangerous. So those people believe that pesticides themselves have some dangers, and certainly there's a lot of validity to that. We've talked about fertilizer, we've talked about pesticides, now for mechanization. If I asked you to name the big difference between a farm today and a farm in 1900, the first thing you might think of is tractors, and certainly you'd be identifying one of the most important things. I think the first internal combustion tractor was produced in 1892, if I remember right. And it didn't take long before people learned how to really start employing machines and fossil fuels on the farm. In 1910, there were 1,000 combines on U.S. farms. By 1930, it increased to 61,000. By 1959, over 100,000 farms had it. And this was a fact that I never even thought about this until I was looking up these statistics. It used to be workhorses and mules would provide a lot of muscle for the farm. Well, mules, workhorses, they need to eat something, so the farmer would have to plant grain, hay, grass for those animals. So by replacing workhorses and mules with tractors, that freed up 93 million acres of cropland for human food. That's quite a feat. Tractors and other machines boost the productivity of labor, so much that not even organic farmers want to exclude these innovations. I don't say that meaning organic farmers are anti-technology. That's certainly not the case. But organic farmers have made it clear that they oppose chemical fertilizers for many reasons. One of them be they're based on fossil fuels, and organic farms want to detach themselves as much as they can from fossil fuels. But they certainly will not go so far as to get rid of tractors. Tractors, of course, fueled by fossil fuels. I want to give you some statistics now just to really reinforce just how much mechanization has contributed to modern agriculture. In 1915, it took more than 10 labor hours on the farm to produce 1 ton of sugar beets. Today, it takes just a little more than 2 hours to produce that 1 ton. Now, it isn't just mechanization that caused that productivity improvement, but certainly mechanization was one of the most important components of it. 1 hour of farm labor today produces 50 times more corn and cotton than it did in 1900, partially because of mechanization. We even harvest grapes with machines now, and some of the best vineyards who raise grapes for premier wines, they're even starting to use mechanized harvesting system. One of these grape harvesting systems I'm showing you here, it can do the work of 40 people. That's a considerable improvement. Now I want to talk about milk production a little bit, and I'm going to show you a video. This is a short video of milk production on the Oklahoma State University farm. This is how cows are milked. They first go in and clean the udder of the cow. Then they're going to dip the teat in iodine to sterilize it. They're going to check the milk to make sure it looks good. Then they're going to attach these automatic milkers. And then there's a machine that uses a vacuum system. It's going to milk the self. Those cows are being milked right here, and the milk's going through those tubes, entering there, and then it's going to go through these tubes into a big tank. And you can milk a lot of cows at one time like this. And while these cows are sitting there being milked, the people working in the dairy can go off and do other things. And I used to work on 2 dairies, and I can promise you, while those cows are being milked, the workers are off doing something else. That's productivity. Now watch this. You don't even have to take the machine off the udder. I think that's remarkable. And one worker, they can milk 12 cows by hand twice a day, or 200 using a modern milking parlor. And I prefer the new method. If you want to see some of the newer technologies like self-driving tractor, robots that apply fertilizer in between corn rows, or my favorite, if you want to see a milking system with no humans, a milking system that does the cleaning, the iodine, the checking, everything you saw the humans do in that video, this one machine can do it now. You can go to this website and search the term robots in agriculture, or go to that link there. Now, one reason we've gone to such mechanization is because farms have a harder and harder time of getting good labor, affordable labor on the farm. Maureen Ugal is one of the best historians of agriculture right now, and in her book, In Meat We Trust, she says this: when labor cannot be found, humans make a logical decision. They replace it with machinery. Americans had a long-standing tradition of doing so. For most of the 19th century, for example, the country suffered chronic shortages of labor that fostered a national passion for mechanization and automation. So too in the 1940s. Factory farming already had plenty of support both in and out of agriculture, and World War II affirmed that enthusiasm. Now I want to talk about how when you mechanize agriculture, the rest of agriculture has to change with the machines. The biology of agriculture production has to be shaped, engineered by humans to match machines. This is a picture of something very similar to what people use to harvest tomatoes now. And this machine this system took decades to produce, because not only did they have to learn how to make the machine, but they had to breed a special tomato plant that could be used with the machine. Now, many of you may have grown tomatoes in your yard. And if you do, you go out to the tomato plant, and today there may be some tomatoes. You harvest it. come back the next day, there may be some more, harvest some more. You can go back every day, every other day to tomato plants and they'll keep yielding tomatoes. And that's fine if you're harvesting tomatoes by hand. But if you've got a machine that's going to go down a row of tomatoes and tear the tomato plant out of the ground to take the tomato off, that normal garden variety of tomato will not work. So they needed to breed a tomato that, one, would have the genetics where all the tomatoes would ripen at once and at the same time. So you'd have the tomato plants, fields and fields. All of a sudden, they'd all turn red with tomatoes. Then you can go in with the machine and harvest all the tomatoes. And when you look back and see that there's no more plants left because of the machinery, you say, that's okay, because the tomatoes had already been ripened in the first place. And also, machines they handle tomatoes rougher than a human hand, so they needed to design tomatoes that could handle the roughness of machines. And it said a machine like this saved the California tomato industry because although it took decades to produce, it was finally commercialized. At the exact same time, immigrant labor became harder to find for farms. I happened to be on the Oklahoma State University dairy farm one day, and I was watching this is their dairy judging class. And by the way, if you want to attend college and you want to take classes where you don't just sit in a room and take notes, animal science classes are great for that because they get you out doing this. This is a student looking at the dairy cows and trying to learn how to look at the cow's body structure to see which ones would be good for milking, which ones need to be, say, removed from the herd. And as I was watching them and listening to what the teacher said, the teacher told them when you look at the udder, you want to make sure that the teats go straight down the udder, not out to the side. Why? Think back to that milking machine that you saw. When you put the milking machine on udders, you had 4 prongs and you put them up like this. But if you had a cow with teats that went out to the side like this, the milking machine wouldn't fit on. So once we invented automatic milking machines, we also had to selectively breed cattle whose udders would conform to the milking machine. So when mechanization comes to agriculture, the biology of agriculture has to change with it. My last example of how agriculture has changed in the last 100 years, I'm going to refer back to an ancient form of farming by the Native Americans, the Iroquois. This is one of my favorite examples. A staple diet of the Iroquois Native Americans was something called the Three Sisters. And the Three Sisters were corn, squash, and beans. This was their main food source. And if you watch the movie The New World, there's actually a scene in there where a Native American is harvesting corn. If you look closely, you can see beans climbing up the corn stalk. That director did a very good job of making sure they got the details right. So why do the Three Sisters work? Because the Three Sisters go well with each other. When you plant the corn stalk, that corn stalk it provides something for beans to climb up, because beans like to climb up something when they grow, so they climb up the corn. Now beans are a legume, and legume is a very special family of plants that can grab nitrogen fertilizer from the air and put it into the soil in a form plants can use. Beans fertilize themselves with nitrogen from the air, and as they fertilize themselves, they're also going to put fertilizer in the ground for the corn and for the squash. And the squash leaves act as shade for the soil and weed control, kind of like mulch does in a garden. Squash have big, broad leaves, and that keeps the ground cooler, so less water will be evaporated. And since it shades part of the ground, it controls weed growth. And another reason these three plants work so well together, because remember, diversity is the enemy of pests. And so this diversity provides plant protection and risk management. This system worked great for the Native Americans. It's great in the garden in your backyard. But it doesn't work in modern agriculture when you're raising corn like this. Today we raise corns we plant the corn plants very, very close to one another, side by side, and in rows that are just not far apart at all. You cannot grow squash in between those corn plants. You cannot grow beans. There's just not enough sun. And also, if you're going to harvest corn like you see in this picture, you can't have squash plants there. You can't have bean plants. And if you did have squash growing there, and even if they did grow, it would be hard for laborers to go in between those corn plants to pick up the squash and the beans to harvest them. So it's because of mechanization that the three sisters just don't make sense anymore commercially. It's just not a good, efficient way of producing corn, beans, and squash. It's better to plant them all on separate fields. And you know how I mentioned that beans help fertilize the corn and the squash? They get nitrogen from the air and provide it to the corn and squash. Well, the price of nitrogen fertilizer is so low now that contribution from the beans just really doesn't matter as much as it used to. The point of all this is to give you a picture of how agriculture has changed due to economies of scale, due to specialization, what's happened as it's gotten bigger, how the farms look different. And this is a graph, if you've seen any of these lectures, you've seen this before. Over the last century, population has risen, while the price of things that farmers produce that go into making our food has fallen. So regardless of what you think of industrialization of agriculture, we have to admit that there are some efficiency gains of agriculture that are worth celebrating. And as a final little quote here, this is from an ag economist here at Lichtenberg. He says, "It is not an exaggeration to say that all of agriculture is intrinsically a struggle against nature." And in many ways, that's true. It doesn't mean we cannot protect nature while we engineer it, and we should. But agriculture is engineering, and you've seen here how the biology of agriculture, the mechanization, fertilization, pesticides, it's all engineering. It's advanced science. And there are some good things of that, but also some drawbacks that we'll talk about in other segments.